Many Canadians like to think it's mostly an issue south of the border, but white nationalism is on the rise here too. These are groups who embrace intolerance and hate and believe Canada's true identity should be European and white. They've become more visible, although they rarely show their faces. The Second Sons, which calls itself a Canadian men's nationalist group, held a march in Niagara-on-the-Lake on Labor Day weekend. In September, at an event called the Canada First Patriot Rally, anti-immigrant protesters faced off against counter-protesters at Christie Pitts Park in Toronto. These groups don't just march. At parks and gyms across the province, they're training, experts say, for what they think is coming, a race war. So what's fueling white nationalism in Canada, and what do we know about these groups? This is The Rundown. What are the roots of white nationalism in Canada, and how has extremism evolved here? Unraveled, a TVO series that unravels key issues happening in Ontario and across the country, investigates in the first part of their three-part series, Origins, the striking rise of right-wing extremism.
I think we don't talk much about extremism at all in the Canadian context.
We often think that this is an American problem. This doesn't happen in Canada.
The extreme seems to be coming closer to the mainstream.
And so we've seen some of these ideas push people into violence, and the speed at which they radicalize the violence has been quite shocking.
They see it as defensive violence, that they had to lash out, that they had to eliminate the threat by murder, by death.
So one of the things in this whole extremism conversation, in who is included, who is not included, state actors are not included.
How did we get here? Let's unravel the rise of right-wing extremism in Canada. How did we get here? Well, we've been here.
And anytime we see a country with a foundation of imperialism and colonization, we're going to have racist, often xenophobic sentiments in that country.
All right, stick with me here. Time for a mini history lesson. Exclusionary practices are one of the few constants in Canadian history. Even before the creation of Canada, the papal bulls were used to justify the seizure and occupation of land from Indigenous peoples. It underpins many of the policies and laws that continue to this day. In the 1600s, colonists enslaved Black and Indigenous people. Slavery in Canada was only abolished in 1833. In the 1840s, the province of Canada segregated Black children into separate schools. In the 1850s, the government laid the groundwork for the Indian Act, that many say was aimed at terminating Indigenous culture and society, and subjugating Indigenous people to colonial rule. In 1883, the government created the first residential schools to forcibly assimilate Indigenous children. In 1885, Canada imposed a tax on all Chinese immigrants entering the country. In the 1910s, Canada had its own branches of the KKK. In the 1930s and 40s, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. And in 1942, the internment and dispossession of Japanese Canadians. In the 1960s, there was the Scoop, forcibly removing Indigenous children from their families and placing them with white families. And the destruction of Africville, a Black community in Nova Scotia, to make way for a bridge. Skinheads in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and in the early 2000s, Canada saw a rise in Islamophobia after 9/11.
It is so important for us to think about, the settler colonial history of Canada and the violence that was enacted to produce the nation state of Canada, and how it has continuously been in the business of producing who belongs and who doesn't belong as part of this nation, right?
History is filled with inflection points, times where things seem to change all at once. Sometimes you don't know you're in one until it's already happened. Let's look at 2015 and what came after. Extremism in Canada has been on a striking rise, and the number of far-right groups has tripled since 2015. And there's been an increase in the number of mass murders associated with far-right extremists.
We had the Quebec City mosque shooting that killed 6 Muslim people, then the Toronto van attack, then of course we had the London, Ontario murders, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where someone has now been charged with 4 murders of Indigenous women.
Before we go further, let's take a look at the far-right ecosystem. Right-wing extremism isn't just white supremacy.
You have a mixture of anti-government, populist, far-right sentiment as you move into different parts of the country. You're seeing kind of the great replacement idea that white people are, under imminent threat to be replaced by immigrant populations.
There's a number of groups driving this far-right sentiment. They include neo-Nazis, incels, anti-authoritarians, ethno-nationalists, militia or patriots movements, and accelerationists.
They're intent on reversing the gains of typically marginalized communities. Increasingly, they are anti-authoritarian as well.
Across Canada, the number of reported hate crimes nearly doubled from 2018 to 2022.
I'm racist. I don't like her. I would kill your children first.
From 2021 to 2022, there was a 12% increase in crimes targeting race or ethnicity, as well as a 12% increase in crimes targeting sexual orientation. Additionally, a 12% increase in violent hate crimes. These include major assaults and death threats. And a 53% increase in the number of homicide victims due to hate crimes.
In fact, if we look at Islamophobic murder specifically, we have had more than per capita than any other country.
Less than 1/3 of the hate crimes reported to police were actually solved. The Canadian Security Intelligence Service is now warning that extremists could increase their violence against the LGBTQ2S+ community through 2024.
Canada's top intelligence agency is warning that extremists could inspire and encourage violence against queer and trans people in the coming year. So yeah, when we talk about anti-LGBTQ2S+ government policies and legislation having some dangerous repercussions, this is the sort of thing we're talking about.
On the ground, the upsurge of hateful activity goes beyond what is reported to police.
And I will leap across the table and punch you right in the mouth.
You're being so
all of
racist.
a sudden I'm being racist.
Yes.
I'm Canadian, so I'm racist. I was born and raised here.
We were.
You!
There is a major gap of what people are saying they are experiencing and what is actually coming to the justice system's attention. Those spewing such hate feel powerful. Those targeted are left feeling helpless and alone.
According to the 2019 Stats Canada survey on victimization, there were over 200,000 self-reported hate incidents that year.
But when you look at hate incidents reported to the police, for the last few years, it represents a fraction, probably about 1% of that number.
Through the General Social Survey, every 5 years, there's this portion on victimization where we simply ask people, have you been the victim of a hate crime? I would respectfully submit that every 5 years is too infrequent to collect that data.
Why are these crimes on the rise? These researchers will tell you, it's not a small question.
They set up hikes, canoe trips, and potlucks. They're also recruiting for fascist fight clubs. How much do we know about these so-called active clubs? How many are there in Ontario, and are they growing? I asked Eric Sito, a reporter for CBC Visual Investigations, who worked for months to track the groups and identify their locations, and Stephen Ray, Senior Research Manager at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a think tank focused on combating hate, extremism, and authoritarianism. Eric, Stephen, really appreciate you guys joining us on the line. Eric, I'm going to come to you first. You're part of a team that investigated white nationalist active clubs in Canada. Before we get into that investigation, I really want to know what led you to this story in the first place.
Yeah, there were a number of reasons why we started looking into this. Primarily, one was that, one of our producers actually last year, he had come across some of these videos that were put out by some of these active clubs. And he noticed when he was trying to find where they were training that there were soccer academies training there. There were, kids playing at these same locations where essentially where these active clubs were training and making their videos. So he said, this is in the public interest. Like, we need to do something about this. Like, they're training next to you, you may not even know it. So that was one of the big things. But one of the other big things too is that, when we started digging into it a little bit more, you realize how much of an overlap there is with white nationalism, with some of the more violent extremist aspects of this. And so it kind of became more evident to us that we needed to do something. But then what really precipitated all of this was actually all those big mass deportation rallies that happened last year or earlier this year. There was, just imagine if you might have seen the videos, but dozens of men, black, outfits, masks, marching around in unison, calling for mass deportations. And we thought to ourselves, okay, these groups are becoming much more bold, seemingly freer to do these things. And so we said, we got to move on this. So we started moving on it.
Stephen, Eric painted that picture quite lovely in terms of what we have been seeing. It seems like the conversation around white nationalism is more prevalent now than ever. This is something that you have been looking at for quite a while. Is that true?
That's right. We're very much seeing a growing white nationalist sentiment in Canada that has really accelerated within the past 5-6 years. And what's really concerning about this as well is not just that the sentiment itself is rising, but the threat is becoming more multifaceted and challenging. So, for example, a lot of these white supremacist ideas that we're seeing now, 5, 6, 7 years ago, were very much confined to the fringes of society. What we've really seen as of late is what we at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue call the mainstreaming of some of these extremist narratives. What was once a fringe idea, some of these anti-migrant beliefs that we see circulate now and now again, they're being picked up in mainstream communities and propagated. And that's part of the concern for us, is when we see some of these ideas move from the fringes to the mainstream, it becomes more challenging to contain and more difficult to mitigate that threat.
I want to talk about StatsCan's 2024 report, Stephen. It revealed that the number of police-reported hate crimes increased for 6 years in a row, more than doubling since 2018. Does that actually match what you're seeing sort of on the grounds with the information that you're analyzing?
It 100% lines up, unfortunately. We monitor very closely some of the online communities amongst domestic extremists in Canada and some of the narratives and conversations they engage in. We've seen an alarming rise in hate speech directed towards different populations in Canada, which often correlate to pretty dramatic increases in offline hate crimes. Just to give you an example, we did some research on the targeting of South Asian communities in Canada, and we found that between 2023 to 2024, online hate speech on X demonizing Canadian South Asians increased by 1,350%. That is an alarming rise, and it also correlates with a massive spike in hate crimes against that community. So there's very much an interplay between some of the online dynamics we see, as well as some of the offline dynamics. These two environments are not mutually exclusive. They feed off of one another, and it's a very concerning trend here in Canada.
We'll pick up a little bit on the sort of online culture, but I want to go back to the active clubs. Eric, if someone is walking through the park, their local park, they may not suspect anything. They may be seeing a couple of people having a workout or something. Can you help explain what are active clubs? Where can they be found?
Well, active clubs can be found across the country now, actually. And some of the stats out there show that there are nearly 200 now around the world. But when we're talking about looking at, what an active club is, it's, I'm going based on what they're going to be saying on their social media, which they're quite prolific with. So what they normally say is, we're here to recruit. We're here to bring people together to, of like-minded people of European descent. And when actually, when experts have told us is that you peel back that layer, that while that is seemingly true, the training, the recruiting, the coming together, creating community, there's actually this kind of insidious layer of we're actually preparing for violence. We're actually, on standby in case something happens, in case, civilization falls, right? Society collapses. So that's the kind of the subtext. That's below the surface, which they're not, you don't want to be too overt about, or at least they're not. But when it comes to where they are, this is what was the part, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, but this is what the part that was important to us, is that there's this public aspect to this that went from, online kind of, propaganda, memes, messaging, and really going and taking that further and going to real world training. So, we'll see them in parks. Most prominently for part of our investigation, we saw them training in like Hamilton's biggest park, right next to a children's garden, and right next to a baseball diamond where kids play, right? Like they're right there next to you sometimes, and most people probably didn't even notice. Maybe they did notice and they just ignored it, but they're training in parks. And what we've also found is that there's this overlap with mixed martial arts or Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and it's not just here in the U.S. There was some reporting that showed that they had been infiltrating Brazilian jiu-jitsu gyms in, I think, Tennessee. One of the active clubs there, they got booted there. And what we found here is that they were also in a number of Southern Ontario gyms, BJGA gyms here, one in Niagara, one in Hamilton, and then also even just like a regular gym with weights and all that. So they're kind of everywhere, and then some of the other stuff they do is they actually go out and they'll do hikes, and they'll show them going hiking around different parts of Ontario, but primarily, and what we've actually noticed since our reporting is that there hasn't been as much of these types of kind of outdoor things, and maybe that's part of the reporting, we don't know, but for a time, for sure, they were definitely these groups were actively in parks and gyms and showing that openly.
Well, Eric, you mentioned the visible presence, but in your investigations, you went and talked to some of the employees of these gyms to see if they knew. What did they have to say?
So we identified 3 gyms in our story, and just remember, we only focused kind of on two groups, right? It was Nationalist 13, one of the bigger ones out of Hamilton, and then a growing one, which is kind of it's almost an active club and everything except the name, Second Sons, founded by a fellow named Jeremy McKenzie, who is a founder of a militia-like organization, according to law enforcement, called Diagolon. So there's 2 kind of main things we focused on. We could have done a national thing, but we wanted to kind of keep it really hyper-focused to show kind of the microcosm of it. But when we went and spoke to these owners that we identified where they were training, all of them said, they did not know this was happening. In one case, they said that they told us after the fact that if they had known, they wouldn't have let them come here, called them scumbags. But then they also got a lot of flack online after, which is interesting in itself, right? Like, so there's that. So it's interesting because a lot of them claim that they didn't know, and we have to take them for their word at this point. But what's interesting is also they're getting a lot of vitriol from the community. So it's kind of interesting, right? Like they are disassociating with, but then when they do, they get this blowback, right, which is kind of interesting.
Interesting. Stephen, active clubs, relatively new in terms of the monitoring that you're doing, or has this been something that has been around?
So the active clubs have actually been around for a number of years. We really saw them start to emerge in Canada sometime in 2021. But Eric touched on a few things there that I think are really important to highlight. They're coming out of the woodwork. We've seen this in the past year in particular, where they've held rallies in places like Hamilton, Toronto, Niagara, all over the province. And that is something that, 2-3 years ago, we didn't see them do as much. They really kept to themselves. They would discuss these extremist ideas sort of privately and maybe pump out some online propaganda. But we didn't really see this degree of street mobilization that we're seeing now. And I think they're sensing a more safe operating environment. That's also concerning as well, because as Eric touched on, there are violent extremists in the ranks of these organizations. In fact, it came out just a couple of weeks ago that a Niagara-based man named Matthew Althorpe was not only the leader of a Southern Ontario-based active club, but he was in fact in a leadership role of a couple terrorist organizations, one of which was called Atomoff Division, which is a listed terrorist entity in Canada, another of which is called Terragram Collective. And it came out in court, actually, that Althorpe had produced several manifestos for the Terragram Collective, which have been cited as inspiration by multiple attackers across the world.
Stephen, for the average person, these ideologies can seem far removed. and I'm hoping you can help shed some light on sort of the inside thinking of some of these people. Where are they coming from?
This is a complicated question and really speaks to a few trends that are playing out, not just within Canada, but I think globally. I'm going to touch on a few factors that really push people into extremism, some of which are not necessarily new, but one of which I think is relatively new for our generation. But there is this sense right now and this growing frustration that things aren't as good as they used to be. There's a lot of economic anxiety. People are finding it more difficult to afford groceries. In Canada, there is a housing crisis, things like that. There's also been a lot of social progress, which has been very good. We're seeing different communities represented in leadership in things like politics, business, media. More diverse people are coming into power. That's great, but often results in some rockiness, right? Traditional leaders in society or traditional groups of people who thought that they had the power are now sensing that they're losing their power. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but those things do sometimes lead people to find scapegoats to blame as to why they're experiencing this decline in society. Now, none of those things are new. That's part of history. History waxes and wanes. The people in power change over time. What I think is a bit new about this generation is the digital environment that we're operating in. So social media has really changed the game and I think accelerated the pace at which people adopt these extremist views. When you're on a social media platform, you are in very much a curated information environment where often some of the most inflammatory and divisive rhetoric is amplified to you because that is the type of material that gains the most engagement on social media and which therefore some of the social media algorithms try to promote. So you're already exposed just by extension of that to more extremist thinking and ideas. There's also the sort of echo chamber dynamic of social media where, it's sort of natural human nature to start following people who share your views and, who confirm your own biases. And that leads to kind of a breakdown in the discussion and the exposure to a diversity of opinions, which could then lead people down an extremist rabbit hole.
You mentioned earlier as well, sort of the importance of making sure you connect the dots with, these are not just average citizens. There is a sort of a track record there. You mentioned Diagolon, you mentioned Second Sons in your reporting. Can you describe their connections and why the audience may be familiar with their names? Because they've been around. If we talk about the Freedom Convoy as well, those names have floated around during that as well.
Absolutely, and I think they came to prominence during that. Diagolon has, according to the Sito report that was released, they're considered a militia-like organization, and law enforcement are fully aware of them. And it was led and founded by a fellow, and I said earlier, Jeremy Mackenzie. And in the last few months, what's happened actually with this group is they founded another group, or Jeremy Mackenzie did, called Second Sons. And what you'll see with this is that it's very similar to an active club in everything but name. They train, they get together, they group with other people, they go across the country. But instead of just being kind of a regional, let's say like Nationalist 13 out of Hamilton, the Second Sons has chapters across the country, and from appearance, from at least from the surface, it seems like they're growing, and they're having all these rallies. We're about to put out a piece in the next little while showing how that they were training basically in cultural centers around the southern Ontario. And we geolocated that and identified it. They had this I guess, a tournament there. And once again, these community centers, or the one we spoke to or reached out to, had no idea they were training there. But they are active, and they're active across the country.
Stephen, I want to come back to social media. On social media, political polarization seems rampant. What are some of the factors causing this discourse online?
Yeah, political polarization is absolutely rampant. We, in our research, we track extremist accounts from across the country, really across the ideological spectrum. And we use large language models to track some of the primary narratives that these individuals espouse online. And we find time and time again that targeted hate against politicians in Canada come up as some of the most frequently discussed topics amongst these extremists. Not only that, but they talk heavily about being extremely disillusioned with the political state of affairs in Canada. And basically, they've gravitated towards this thought that, elections, party politics, platforms, voting, all of these things are essentially frivolous and are not going to lead them to the kind of solution and the kind of ideal vision of society that they're really hoping to achieve. I think the reasons why this is happening are quite complex. Again, I'll bring up the idea of social media itself. You're exposed to a lot of noxious views simply by nature of those algorithms that are literally putting in your face some of this divisive rhetoric, because it tends to engage people a little bit more so than messages that, for example, offer sort of nuanced opinions and really in-depth explanations as to what's going on. I think that dynamic as well is sort of coinciding with a decline in trust of establishment institutions in Canada. So it's not just the government, for example, that people are losing faith in. It's all sorts of segments of society. It could be our education system, it could be our media, law enforcement and courts, right? People feel that these establishment institutions are just not fit or not managing societal problems as effectively as perhaps they were in the past. And so that's really leading to a huge spike in political polarization and a huge decline in trust in terms of, our politicians and our government being able to, pave the way forward and really manage these problems effectively.
Stephen, last question to you very quickly. Should members of the public be worried?
It's important not to hit the panic button prematurely. I think Canadians, by and large, are welcoming people. We have a really vibrant multicultural society. Diversity is respected. We compare ourselves to a lot of European countries and, our neighbors down south. I actually think Canada is still relatively doing quite well. I would say, however, that we need to be very diligent about monitoring this rise in hate, polarization, and extremism. We can't just simply rest on our laurels because, we think our society is doing relatively well, that therefore we shouldn't be taking this problem seriously. We do have to take it really seriously because things can always get worse. Just because we're not seeing widespread violence on the streets doesn't mean we can't get there. We really need to adopt a proactive posture in trying to clamp down on some of this extremism we're seeing in society before it spirals out of hand.
We're going to leave it there, gentlemen. Stephen, really appreciate it. Eric, thank you so much. Really great investigation there. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
We are building this show for you, and we want you to build it with us. What issues do you want to know more about? What do you like or not like about what we're doing so far? Let us know. Send an email to rundown@tvo.org or reach out to me on Instagram @jnjagannath. We'll see you next week.